Good morning. I wasn't quite sure if the introduction had finished. Noel, you know, and I'd be surprised if those of you who have felt compelled to come here this morning hadn't seen at least one of the other events that Noel has appeared at. So I'm going to assume that most of you have a broad idea of what he has been saying about the need for a constitutional reform and a genuine and meaningful recognition of the place of First Nations, the First Nations within this nation. So, partly I'd like to base this conversation on the personal and the historical, and partly on that broad canvas of contemporary debate about constitutional recognition and reform. But rather than going back over old ground, drawing from Noel a little more about the thinking behind it. Noel, in your quarterly essay of 2014, A Rightful Place, you talked about Indigenous Australians being caught between the frontier destruction inflicted by colonialism and the paternalistic protection of colonialism, between the devil and the deep blue sea. How did that apply in Queensland, and in particular to Cape York and your own family, your grandparents, for example?
Well, I had always been troubled by the history of Tasmania as a child, the passing of Truganini, what all that meant. So I did a lot of reading of history in that year leading up to the essay. And of course, Queensland was as violent, if not more profoundly violent a frontier as anywhere in the country. And the sheer history of genocide southward, up to the north, through Cape York, was a history that I was and my people were a part of. My grandfather ended up in the Lutheran mission at Hope Valley as a result of that process. The gold rush in the hinterland of Cooktown decimated our people within less than a decade, and the young 19-year-old missionary came and he saw the destruction, and he decided, he was on his way to New Guinea, he decided to set up a mission on the north shore of Cooktown. So that was an act of protection and preservation in the face of imminent annihilation. And our elders, my grandparents, were forcibly removed to the mission when they were 5 and 10 years old, respectively, torn away from the bush, brought without the consent of their parents to the mission, and I grew up in that same mission. So we've always been torn between the protection afforded by the reservation and the Lutheran mission, and the fact that the mission became a reason for removing children as well. So the mission became a part of the apparatus of the stolen generations. On the one hand, it had saved us. On the other hand, it became the repository of more and more waves of children being torn away from their parents and their homelands and brought to this place. So that is why in that essay, Kerry, I see, and I for the first time understood these two pincers, one of frontier genocide and the other pincer being that of protection. And the missionary himself, to be fair, was aware of this troubling role that the mission played in harvesting the young children from their bush life and tearing them away from their families and being brought to the mission. It was a very troubling process.
But his understanding of that wouldn't necessarily have been shared by other missionaries on other missions, because many of them saw it as a mission from God to actually rescue the children.
Absolutely. And so the history of missions is a very diverse one. There were some missions that absolutely tore down the local customs, refused the speaking of the local languages, rituals and traditions were prohibited. The Presbyterians on Western Cape York at places like Aurukun were actually very enlightened. They kept the initiation ceremonies, they kept the language going, they allowed the people to syncretize Christianity with local beliefs, whereas other mission stations and other organisations just completely banned Aboriginal culture from the mission. And ours, the one I grew up in, was a kind of halfway house. We would not have the language today if it wasn't for the missionaries. But on the other hand, he prohibited dancing, he prohibited ceremony, and so the story is a very diverse story.
You talked about the casual parsimony of killing on the frontiers in your essay. What exactly do you mean by the term casual parsimony?
Well, the stories I'd heard through the oral histories of my elders in my community, the subterranean of oral storytelling, and accounts. And the account that I recount in my essay is written by one of our earliest missionaries when he came over in 1887. And he tells this story of a man that had been living in the bush, like my own great-grandfather, pursued by the trackers and the police because they wanted to grab him and remove him to Palm Island. And he was accused of some crime, and the missionary tells this story of the native trackers and the sergeant arresting this man, taking him down the road. You hear the gunshot, and Diddigal is no more. And it struck me when reading the passage how mundane this story was.
And the missionary himself, I think, said that he got his just desserts.
Yes, and it was completely accepted that kind of extrajudicial killing was just a normal part of Queensland life in those days. The killing of Aboriginal people was no more profound an act than killing a wallaby or killing a cow. Probably less grief.
And perhaps the cow would have been seen to have more value.
Absolutely. And in the early days of the mission, right up until the 1920s and 30s, there are stories in the oral tradition of unofficial killings of Aboriginal people in camps. The native trackers played a big role in this genocidal process, and the official figures about the massacres on the frontier can never be relied upon, because the process of killing was not official. It was a farmer could shoot an Aboriginal person walking across his land as casually as you would shoot vermin.
It's always struck me when you talk about oral history, it's always struck me that one really fundamental discrimination against Indigenous Australia was that at least up until about 1920, 1930, possibly even later in some parts of Australia, Indigenous Australians only had oral history to rely on to tell their side of any story, whereas non-Indigenous records were as often as not on paper, and they were written by the people who were talking only from their perspective more often than not. I just wonder how you would have felt when you saw Keith Windshuttle, who's been very active, perhaps not recently, but was for a long time very active in leading a kind of conservative side in the broad debate, endeavouring to write off Aboriginal oral history as tales my granny told me.
Yeah. That was a horrific period in the country's history. The ascendancy for that brief period of the wind shuttle view of Aboriginal history and Australian history, it's, and I think that we were very definitely on the back. The truth was on the back foot during that time. And my attempt in the quarterly essay, particularly dealing with the question of Tasmania, because I'm just struck how Australians fail to deal with Tasmania. And so I did a lot of reading about the history wars and the histories concerning the destruction of the Tasmanians. I think, as I say in my few comments in the essay, the fact that an Aboriginal community survived the genocide down there, the descendants of whom are now number in the thousands down in Tasmania today, the fact that we celebrate their survival has somewhat obscured the profundity of what happened in the destruction of the people in the 19th century. There was a 98% loss of life. The population drop, and we as Australians, I don't know, Kerry, whether you grew up learning about Truganini, but I did at primary school. I don't,
and not much else about Indigenous Australia.
And not much about Indigenous Australia, but she was like Far Lap's heart. It was or Don Bradman's batting average. You know, one of those things we all got to learn about, but we've never reflected on how it is that we've been able to deal with Tasmania. I don't think we have. Australians have not dealt with Tasmania. Whereas in the 19th century at the time, and through much of the 20th century, Tasmania was the kind of case study of genocide. It was a well-known worldwide case study of the destruction of the people. And my little booklet coming out of that essay, The War of the Worlds, actually referred to the Wells's inspiration for the War of the Worlds was the Tasmanian genocide, because
That's the first time I'd heard that, and
Yeah.
I suspect that would be true for
a
most
production of world culture like the War of the Worlds was actually inspired by the story that Wells heard from his brother about how the arrival of the Europeans down there resulted in the extinction of the people.
You describe yourself as a third-generation legatee of mission protection. Now, for you personally, what were the benefits of that and what was the downside?
I actually had the real great privilege of doing a history thesis at Sydney University. I really enjoyed my time at the history department down there. And then I had an opportunity to do some research on the history of my own mission. And I found myself torn between these two pincers, the story of protection versus the story of destruction.
Because the odds are you would never have even thought of going to Sydney University without the education that came from your mission upbringing. Would that be right?
Yeah. Old Joe Bajilka Peterson once said in his last days that Pearson is an ingrate. Because we gave him an education at one of our schools.
We gave him an education.
We gave him an education at one of our Lutheran schools, and he's turned out to be an ingrate. But that is the kind of complexity that our people deal with. And we've come to understand that, ultimately the paternalism of the missionaries was a form of racism. Ultimately, that paternalistic regime in the mission was racist.
So how did you personally experience racism growing up? I mean, it seems to me that the insidiousness of racism is not just at its most violent, but the pervasive nature of it.
Yeah. I grew up in the mission at the time when we were under a very strict legal regime controlled by the state of Queensland. My parents couldn't move out of the reserve without a letter of authority. Whenever my father worked as a drover outside of the community, he had to get permission, and his money was managed by the protector. And
So as you became aware of that, how did that make you feel? I mean, did that give you, was the message basically, I am inferior?
that was
I must be.
that was what the world was telling us. And whenever I went into Cooktown with my mother and my grandmother, I could very distinctly feel that we had a distinct place in the town. We would go to the hospital, and then we would go down to the park. We had a very confined and defined place whenever we went out of the reserve, and most aspects of our life in the mission were controlled by the superintendent. I was born before the 67 referendum, so the constitutional status of our people was also a situation where we were non-citizens. I was born a non-citizen of Australia. And there was nothing with my parents or my grandparents that showed me that we had an entitlement to participate in Queensland and in Australia as equal citizens.
I can remember Stan Grant, the broadcast journalist who is Indigenous, describing the cumulative effect of racism over a lifetime, the corrosive nature of it. Does that resonate with you? That even somebody like you, who does, you would find yourself in a privileged position in a sense. You've worked for every step of it, but nonetheless, you are in a position of some power. Does that resonate with you? That corrosive and ongoing cumulative effect of racism?
I think it's the big barrier. It is still the big barrier. I think along with class, race, they're the two barriers we have for advancement. And they play with each other. Sometimes it's a class dynamic, sometimes it's a race dynamic, and one will use the other to keep you out. So even when we succeed, you face barriers of downward envy and so on. You know, these class dynamics of wanting to keep Indigenous people where they are, in their place. So I've come to understand it as a combination of both, but, and I think the two sides of politics and the two sides of the wider community are both a help and a hindrance to us overcoming those barriers.
We'll perhaps develop that a little more soon. But
Yep.
So to the racism that is still inherent in the disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, how would the right constitutional reform, according to your view, change that in a practical sense?
I think the problem with Australia for our people is that it does not license us to retain our culture and our identity and our heritage, as well as engage in the society and economy and the opportunities of Australia. We're not allowed to have both. That's the problem with Australia. They want us either to keep our culture and traditions. Some people want us to keep our language, culture, traditions, and not engage in development. And then we have another mob who say, well, actually, abandon your culture and language, engage in the society and the economy, get educated, get healthy, get employed, get careers, get wealth. And we're not allowed to actually have both. And I see other ethnic groups, such as the Jews, such as the Vietnamese, such as the Japanese and so on, people around the world are able to keep both. But in Australia, blackfellas aren't allowed to keep both. And we're harassed by one group to abandon our culture and by another group to not embrace development. I think we've got to get to a stage where constitutionally we should be allowed to be assured in relation to our heritage.
Simply because you are the First Nations?
Because it is the heritage of the country.
And so just tell me the difference that you see between Indigenous Australians and their history and their heritage, or their contribution to the heritage of Australia, and those of much more recent arrivals and other ethnic groups who form part of multicultural Australia, because you talk about the three strands of our nation. The First Nations, the institutions and cultural input from Britain, and the more recent input of other ethnic groupings. Now, what rights do you claim or demand for First Nations that wouldn't already be delivered to you as a part, philosophically that is, as part of, as simply one group in a multicultural Australia, with equal rights with other groups in that multicultural Australia?
The difficulty with making our case with the likes of Andrew Bolt and others is that the minute we say we are Indigenous, they say, oh, he's talking about race again. There's this intellectual dishonesty in relation to conflation of race and indigeneity. And no amount of saying to him, well, actually, there are Indigenous people who are white in some parts of the planet. There are Indigenous people with blue eyes in some parts of the world. This is not about race. This is about people having an original connection with the soil. And the thing I explored in my quarterly essay was what is this fundamental Indigenous relationship with territory? And surprising to me, I found some resonance in the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, who talks about respect for the dead being a basic conservative impulse. You know, conservatives respect the relationship we have with the dead. And it struck me the commonality between that idea and what a judge in a famous sovereignty case called the Western Saharan case, where Judge Amoun said in that case, you know, the essential basis of sovereignty is the man or woman who was born from the land, remains connected to the land, and who will one day be reunited with their ancestors in the soil. That is the essence, Kerry, of indigeneity. People coming from the soil, remaining connected with the soil, and returning thither to be reunited with their ancestors. And Judge Amoun said that is the essence of sovereignty. And if you understand that in an Indigenous sense, this is a universal concept. People have a connection with their ancestors whose bones are in the soil, whose dust is part of the land. And you remain connected with their spirit. And this is a real thing. This is not just a kind of theory or something. The reality of people's spiritual relationship with their ancestors who form part of the soil is a real thing.
But I assume you don't deny more recent arrivals in this country of feeling that same respect for the dead, that they would see their bones going back to the same soil.
Absolutely. So I had to come to the somewhat uncomfortable conclusion that even Andrew Bolt was becoming Indigenous. because the bones of his ancestors are now becoming part of the territory. It's just that I'd asked Andrew to respect the fact that Galarrwuy Yunupingu's ancestors have been here for
One or two generations longer.
A few generations longer than his. But so this concept of the triune nation, the three parts to our nation, without getting theological about it, Kerry, you know, the Indigenous foundations, the British institutions, and the multicultural achievement. They seem to me to be the three things that are embedded in the soil of Australia. And in the years ahead, and particularly over the next 2 years, I think, we need an illumination of that trinity, of those three parts, and an illumination that gets us all to understand and, in a sense, recognise each other, and recognise who we have become and who we may be in the future.
Okay, so on the way to teasing out with you the kind of interface you're having with the power structures of Australia to achieve real constitutional reform, let me ask you this. During the interview series with Paul that I did with Paul Keating and then the book, has given me some sense of how extraordinarily difficult it was for the Keating government to frame its native title legislation in response to the High Court's Mabo ruling. And that was with a Prime Minister passionately committed to it. Now, you were at the centre of those very intense and often bitter negotiations, and there were times when your bitterness and those of some of your Indigenous colleagues was turned on the government. What are your most powerful memories from that process, and what lessons did you learn? That was a process, there was a lot that led into it, but the negotiation process itself lasted for about 8 or 9 very solid months.
Yeah. I think it was a desperate time. People forget how the forces were lined up to extinguish native title utterly.
Particularly in Queensland and Western Australia.
Absolutely. And they'd done it in Western Australia. So without the Keating legislation, native title would have been dead right across WA, and the Goss government would have done the same thing here in Queensland. So, you know, it was a desperate time when governments were mobilising at the state level to completely extinguish native title. And so there was this desperate need to protect the title from extinguishment. But there was also the need to address the fact that many groups had lost their land utterly. And there was a need to repossess groups that did not have access to native title. And so the negotiation of the Indigenous Land Fund as a mechanism to buy back leasehold and freehold properties for tribes that did not have access to native title was a kind of additional component to the deal that we did with Keating that went beyond the Mabo decision. There was another element of the decision which we got accused, Keating and I and others got accused of subterfuge in relation to the question of pastoral leases, because there was intense lobbying to extinguish native title in pastoral leases. And anyway, part of the upside of 1993 was the fact that native title survived in pastoral leases, and it enabled the Witt decision to come along 3 years later and establish that native title also coexists over a much broader area of Australia than originally thought.
Keating says that at that very first meeting with you and your fellow Indigenous leaders, and at that point there had been no, there was no kind of broad Indigenous leadership in Australia. You were a series of leaders of individual nations or communities. And his challenge to you, he said, was you cannot just come in here, if you're serious about this, really serious, you cannot just come in here, put down your letter of demands, and if we don't immediately agree to it, you accuse us of being racists and storm out. He said that particularly, you said later that really resonated with you, that you have to come prepared to compromise?
There was a point in the whole negotiations, the Black Friday moment, when we had really come to a view that the miners and the farmers and the states had really pushed the whole response to a bad place. And then following Tuesday, we recovered the situation with direct negotiations with Keating. But the thing that pulled it back on track was Keating knew what our psychological tender point was. And he basically challenged us as to whether we were psychologically able to show leadership. And my reaction to Keating saying that on the Friday afternoon was, this is a horribly racist thing for the Prime Minister to say, to accuse us of psychological incapability. And of course, it was the needle point. It was the needle point at the most sensitive place. Because you can't win entirely with the politics of no. There's got to be points at which, in order to push the show forward, where you've got to be prepared to say yes. And what was done in relation to pastoral leases, for example, that preserved the Wick decision for later enjoyment, was this capacity to say yes, but we understand the detail better than everybody else. And so what was a kind of political concession was, in the long run, a major strategic win.
And part of your way, a big sticking point was the Racial Discrimination Act. You, I would think quite rightly, and others were saying, you cannot put the RDA aside in reaching a decision. We can't be a party to that. So you were instrumental in finding a way of keeping the RDA intact by having add-ons, really, didn't you? The whole land compensation deal, and even the Stolen Generations inquiry were a part of the process that softened any breach of the RDA.
Yeah.
So my question to you is this. How much have you learned from that? How much has that governed your thinking in your approaches since, in your interface with government, and from, I think, about 1998 on, you took this view, which has alienated some and caused you to have a longer list of enemies than you otherwise might have had, which was to deal much more, to be on the front foot much more in dealing with the conservative side of politics, where you had previously been identified as classically, broadly speaking, on the left and more in the Labor camp. So that whole point about being smartly pragmatic without sacrificing too much, tell me about that.
My test, Kerry, is everything we do and all of the privilege and opportunities we enjoy now are a result of us standing on the shoulders of a long history of activism by Aboriginal leaders going back to the early part of the 20th century. And my test for what we do in the present is, are we pushing the show forward, or are we endangering future progress? Because we shouldn't do anything. The pragmatic test is we don't foreclose on future progress. But if we can push the show on and build on the great achievements of our predecessors, then we can't shy away from the hard political choices that need to be made. I think that, old Goff's, surely the impotent are pure.
Yeah.
This
is Whitlam talking about the old left in Labor, and he was trying to reform the Labor Party without which he would probably not have got government in 1972. And his message to the left, the hard left of Labor, was only the impotent are pure. That's the point.
And so and also, you know, I think the contemporary leadership has got to understand also, as I try to, that there'll be a new generation of leaders who will cross Jordan to the other shore. There will be leaders after us who will take the show further on. And our job is to keep asking ourselves, is anything that we're doing foreclosing on future progress? And if it is, then, you know, it's probably the wrong idea. For example, one of the big questions for recognition is, if we just accept a symbolic response in this next constitutional question, if we just achieve symbolism, I think we'll be taking the show backwards. It is not the right strategy, and it is not the right politics to just accept some kind of symbolic preamble and so on.
But before we get to that, what about the intervention in this context? Because you initially spoke out very strongly for intervention because you saw it as about saving children at a really fundamental level. But with hindsight, weren't you used in that process? And you now have a different view of intervention to the one you had when it was first announced.
Well, actually, the true history of this is that we proposed, after 2 years of consultation, a major reform program for some communities in Cape York. That was our proposal to Brough. And we put to him a massive volume based on 2 years of consultation. We wanted our elders to be in charge of the obligations of our community members. If parents were not looking after their children, we wanted our elders to be empowered to intervene. So our Cape York model is actually an elders-based intervention. People forget about that. The critics of our welfare reform agenda just completely ignore that the mechanism of intervention is our elders, who are empowered under legislation to deal with young parents. Brough took our policy and constructed the Northern Territory intervention not based on using elders as the point of intervention, but using Centrelink and using the bureaucracy to put a blanket coverage over people's welfare. The Cape York model does not touch anyone's welfare. It only touches people's welfare if the elders say that those parents are neglecting their children.
Did you come to regret supporting that intervention at that time?
Oh, I'm still, it is a...
Because apart from anything else, the RDA was bypassed.
Yeah. Our model did not involve a suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act because the empowerment of elders is a special measure. It actually empowers the village and its leaders to deal with issues of parental neglect and so on.
But did you come to regret their model for the Northern Territory?
Well, in truth, I look at things from both sides. The fundamental issue here is that there's a crisis in Indigenous Australia of the removal of children. Children are being moved at a greater rate from their families today than they were during the worst times of the stolen generations. You go around Cairns and you see billboards. You can see them here on the Sunshine Coast. You see billboards. We need more foster parents. Those foster parents are taking Aboriginal children by the hundreds away from their families and their communities. So, Kerry, if you ask me, well, should we step back and do nothing and allow those children to continue to be sent out into protection? This is the new version of protection, removal to foster parents and foster group homes and so on. Hundreds of children, one of which from Arakoon is down on the Sunshine Coast here, a little girl. And I'm horrified when I see her. That she does not have a connection back to her family and home anymore. And that is because we think that all should play out. The family collapses, the children are neglected, the child protection officers come in, pick the children up and take them out. So I'm torn. I can't give you a straight answer to your question because I'm kind of torn. Well, would I have preferred an intervention that helped that family stay together and that child...
Isn't there a more acceptable form of intervention that can still be effective? Possibly in the end more effective than that, if what you're describing potentially is going to set up other problems down the track.
Yeah, problem is we don't have them. Apart from our elders-based intervention, there are no other solutions. And that is why the story is that every month there's children being taken out of the communities and put into the child protection system. Some of our states, 70% of the kids are Indigenous in the child protection system. 3% of the population, 70% of the kids in child protection.
Now, when you apply similar statistics, not as dramatic but utterly disproportionate, to Indigenous Australians in jail compared with the population, broadly speaking, you see that as racism. There is an injustice to a race of people there. Why is that not also the case with this mass of children, as you say, up to 70%, and not letting off the hook parents who might have failed, but whose very failure might also be a part of the greater failure of this whole nation?
Okay. We are now come to the point where 40% of the prison system, Indigenous, and we're only 3% of the Australian population. That is not a gap.
No.
That is not a socio-economic gap that is going to be resolved by socio-economic policies aimed at closing the gap. This is a structural problem. And the structure of race and class are tangled up in it. I think ultimately we've got to attack the problem from two ends, both from the fact of on-the-ground behaviour of parents, but we've got to attack the problem from the other end, the structural end as well. We need a structural solution because, this whole tragedy is playing out because of our structural disempowerment.
And
I don't deny, in fact, my whole agenda with constitutional recognition in empowered communities is a recognition that there is a structural dimension to this that we have to tackle. But I'm in favour of tackling the problem at both ends, both at the level of personal empowerment of mothers taking charge of their children, gathering them to their breasts, and having a jealous regard for their growth and development and their education and health. We've got to work at that level, but at the same time we have to work at the structural level that has produced this dissolution at the village level, this breaking down of relationships at the village level. We've got to tackle the problem at both ends.
So if we have time towards the end, I'd like to touch briefly on the issue of empowerment of communities and what you've achieved so far, because it seems to me on the surface that there is enormous potential there for the most practical of solutions. But you spoke the other day in this tent that this moment represents a tight window for good constitutional reform. Now, what is the cost of failure as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think the imprisonment one, the statistic in relation to that, which is just outrageous, it's worse than African Americans. The United States is coming to terms with the over-imprisonment of black Americans. We are proportionally in a worse position. The overrepresentation of our children in the child protection system, in juvenile detention, the figures are just outrageous. So those figures will continue to be as bad as they are. There'll be no closing of the gap. This is not a gap. This is a structural problem. And so the cost, as you ask, the cost will be that every January or every February when Parliament reconvenes, we will have a closing of the gap report tabled that will tell us that the gulf remains. That's the cost. And the other cost is that the opportunity to tackle the structural dimension of our disempowerment will be lost for another generation. We will lose this window we have, I believe, until the politics is regathered, a bit like the Republic. You know, it's been a long time since 1999, and we don't know when the agenda will come around, when the planets will line up again. It'll be the same with us, that the next opportunity to really reform Indigenous affairs as a structural challenge will be lost to us for generations. But at the same time, we can't have a cheap recognition.
All right, so let's talk about the recognition. I'd like to just, as quickly as we can, get through the key changes you want to see. You've lost interest in a kind of preamble or a statement within the Constitution which formally recognises Aboriginal nations, First Nations. You have been taken by the idea, which came from a conservative think tank, for a declaration of recognition, which would be a kind of floating document or even as a statute. Now, what is that going to do? What is the essence of what you want that declaration to say, and what do you believe that achieves outside the Constitution?
There's kind of three parts. One is the symbolic poetry, a substantive structural reform, and getting rid of the racist elements, the kind of the ugly things in the Constitution referring to race. So in relation to, you're asking a question in relation to the symbolic poetry.
Yeah.
And my view is that I am not at all enthused about a miserable few lines at the start of the Constitution.
And you believe that would be miserable
it would be miserable because the lawyers the words ownership of Australia will never appear in such a preamble.
Because some would be concerned about legal implications.
And because all the lawyers will be saying, the High Court is going to interpret ownership of Australia to mean that all the white fellas are going to have to be loaded back on the ship and punted back to England. You know, so, and I think if we can't use the words ownership, why bother? If we can't acknowledge that the Indigenous people were the original owners of Australia, why bother with the weasel words at the front of the Constitution? The concept of a declaration of recognition would be, in fact, a much longer document. It'd be a kind of Gettysburg Address length recognition, one that hopefully future children will be able to recite at school, and Parliament would recite this declaration, a bit like the American Declaration of Independence. Remember, that declaration has no legal foundations whatsoever. It stands as a declaration in its own historical and moral strength. And so the idea of a declaration of Indigenous recognition being a much more handsome statement that can in fact locate Indigenous recognition within this three-part.
So it would have a moral and symbolic force.
Moral and symbolic force. Remembering that the Treaty of Waitangi does not have legal effect either. It has a historical and moral force, and the people of New Zealand and the legal system take reference from that in domestic law. So if we're going to have the poetry bit, I think is better served in a declaration outside of the Constitution.
So very quickly, how much support does that concept now have amongst the rest of the Indigenous leadership in Australia?
I think that,
as opposed to something inside the Constitution.
I think people who come across this idea think that that's an idea by itself, but it is only an idea if you've got a substantive structural reform also. There's got to be something in the Constitution that is actually of substantive benefit. So the two ideas go together.
So when you're looking at Section 26, which is inherently racist,
yep,
it seems there's no argument about that. The Select Committee supports its removal.
Get rid of that, yes.
Then you've got Section 51, or a part of Section 51. That's a bit more problematic, isn't it?
Yes, because it retains the idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are a distinct race. And the Parliament was given the power in 1967 to legislate in respect of peoples of the Aboriginal race, with all of the assumption that we were somehow inferior or different from other Australian citizens. We are different only in respect of our indigeneity. That is what makes us different, that we're indigenous to the country, but we're not a separate race. So the need to change Section 5126 so that it is a power in respect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples rather than peoples of a race, of an Aboriginal race. I think that's a very important reform, but there's got to be a much more substantive provision in the Constitution that deals with our structural disempowerment.
So, some years after Mabo, you wrote in the Griffith Review that, quote, "Never before, and likely never again, would Indigenes be invited in from the wood heap to sit at the main table as they did during those Keating years. This just confirmed the opinion that Aborigines are electoral poison. No more bleeding hearts, no more prime ministerial insistence that the blackfellas come in from the cold," unquote. Are you back from the wood heap again now or not? In other words, do you believe that the debate over Indigenous constitutional recognition and reform is a genuine process with a genuine commitment from both major parties to get a significant outcome?
We're going to see the proof in the pudding in this next year. So in 2016, there'll be a process of Indigenous conferences on the 4 compass points of the country, and indeed 8, 12, northwest, southwest, and so on. Well, there are going to be a series of conferences in the centre and in the Torres Strait where Indigenous peoples will debate and consider constitutional reform. All of the models, including models that I've pushed and other people have pushed, will be considered at these conferences between February and around mid-year or after mid-year 2016. And then there will be a process of what comes out of those Indigenous conferences of dealing with the federal government and the Leader of the Opposition in relation to whether there's consensus around a model going forward. I think it has not been stated, but I think that it is likely that the government has in mind that a referendum question might be put on the 50th anniversary of the 67 referendum in May 2017. So this year of 2016 is a very critical year which will determine whether an inclusive process of consultation, of designing and negotiating a model will play out or not.
Bearing in mind how skillfully John Howard presented the convention to determine whether we would support, whether we would have a referendum and what sort of referendum we might have on Australia becoming a republic, and how out of that, and if you were cynical, you'd say that that was the intent, but how out of that the Republican movement was absolutely and profoundly split to a point where there was no way that reform was going to be achieved. I would think even in this process of Aboriginal consultation, the risk of division is strong. Now, you mightn't want to say this, but I'll say it, that it seems to me that you and Pat Dodson are probably the two most influential and powerful Aboriginal leaders in the country. How confident are you that you two will be able to, are you now and will you be able to stay on the same platform and emerge united in your leadership within Indigenous communities in this first process of consultation?
Well, there's sweet unanimity in our community.
When you say our community, define it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is the real challenge for us. If we fracture I think the window will be lost. I think one mechanism for keeping people at least sceptical and involved in a process of debate and discussion, one possible mechanism for ensuring that is to say that at the end, when a model is kind of proposed, maybe there ought to be a plebiscite of Indigenous Australia first, to see if the majority of Indigenous Australians favour the question being put. If
I can see the logic behind that and the rationale behind that, Noel, but I just wonder how practical that would be and how other Australians, how that might be exploited.
I think there's a danger of people exploiting that idea as a separatist process and so on. But I really think also that there's a counter argument, which is 3% of the population are not going to win or lose this referendum.
No.
So it would be good to know where Indigenous Australians stood in relation to any question.
But can't the leadership speak for them? If you've got genuine leaders from all of those communities engaged in a convention process, can't they speak for those communities without a plebiscite?
I think the concept of having north, south, east, west, northwest, southwest, southeast, southwest, Torres Strait, centre, Tasmania, if we have a comprehensive set of conferences and delegates are drawn from each of those conferences to an all-in, maybe in the centre, is the idea that's being discussed, that delegates from each of these regions would come together in an all-in. Then we would have to have some kind of mechanism to understand where our community stood in relation to a model. And I think that I think we've got our work obviously cut out for us in relation to this. And can I say that the other urgency here is those communities that are struggling to retain their languages, retain their traditions of passing on knowledge to young people, younger generations. These are things that are on the precipice. And if we don't get a kind of a cultural guarantee, a space for Australia to recognise the heritage of our people, I don't think there's a lot of communities I see around the country that they're going to lose so much in the next few years, in the next generation, if we don't take advantage of the window soon.
There are so many issues that are left untouched today, and I knew that would be the case. This is a big story. For those of you who are not already familiar with it, and I know Noel spoke on another platform this week about the empowerment of Aboriginal communities, and there is a fascinating process going on that is in train with, it seems to me, enormous potential. Please, all you, invest in Dr. Google on this one. It's fascinating and impressive. But I'm going to end, and we didn't even get to discuss your other driving imperative to see a formal voice for Indigenous Australia into the parliamentary process, not sitting within Parliament, but into. Personally, I'm sceptical that you'll get at least the government side of this equation to embrace it, because it was, after all, a Conservative government that dismantled ATSIC, which was the last time there was a truly representative body with a voice from Aboriginal Australia. I'm going to finish on a personal note with this question. Paul Keating told me that you had knocked back 2 opportunities to enter Parliament in safe Labor seats when you were a much younger person, really on the crossroads of your career and life. 2 opportunities to enter the federal parliament in safe Labor seats, one in Melbourne and one in Sydney. Is that true? What decided you to turn your back on a parliamentary career that could have put you at the very centre of power in Australia? And have you ever had moments of regret about that decision?
I've come to regret that, mainly because the theory I've been running on, Kerry, for the last 15 years has been we can do more from the outside and we can get our agendas going from outside. And we've been able to do we've made a lot of progress. You know, base camp is well below. The summit's still way up high, but we're on the road. But at the same time, the kind of effort we've had to put in to make those gains has brought me to the point of questioning, well, did I take the right fork in the road? And there were 2 things that caused that decision. One was I didn't know that you could enter and participate in parliamentary life when the situation of our people is still so unresolved. You know, if we had resolved these questions that we're still trying to tackle, I would have felt a greater comfort in that kind of choice. But so that was one kind of hearkening thought. The other was that I'm very passionate about the ground up work. I really love it when, you know, we got hundreds of kids now going to good colleges, getting more educated than I was. I love it when families get together and when a mother comes knocking on my door and says, can I get my kid to go to that school? What do I need to do? What money do I need to put aside? What can we do to support our child going down to Brisbane to get a good education? I'm more, my interest is in empowering our mob at the grassroots.
But in the process, not becoming an assimilationist.
But in the process, not abandoning it. The work we do with language revival, for example, and revivifying our languages. I am just so proud and so really excited about the efforts that are being made to teach our children their traditional languages. But at the same time, you don't have a solution to the structural predicament. I see so many good people working under the hot sun, but they've got an unresponsive government. And we don't have a solution for those good people who are doing good work in their relations with government. We have this fundamental structural disempowerment that has to be resolved. So my answer, Kerry, is that, you know, I really toss a coin in relation to what was the better route. And you know...
If you don't die still with a dilemma in front of you, Noel, I'll be deeply surprised, but I'll have gone before you. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Kerry O'Brien for his knowledgeable and insightful questions, and to Noel Pearson for informing us of the historical issues that have informed what is still happening today. And as the voice of Indigenous Australians, the needed changes hopefully will happen.